This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war.
I've lived abroad most of my life, and these images tend to sum up how the rest of the world views us. We're a practical bunch, but prone to letting our hair down quite spectacularly when the mood strikes. Fantasy is my chosen field, and I've long been intrigued as to what it is that makes the British so prolific when it comes to writing works of fantasy and imagination, from Puck to Potter, Alice to Aslan, Toad to Tiddlywinkle. Quite simply, since whoever dreamt up Beowulf put quill to vellum, we've led the world in this field. The figures speak volumes. 16 out of the top 35 best-selling authors in any language, in any genre, are fantasy writers, and 13 of those 16 are British fantasy writers, which is quite an incredible achievement in my view. And it's not just readers in English either. Peter Rabbit has been translated into 35 languages. Paddington Bear has been translated into 40 languages, including, slightly strangely, hieroglyphics. And the granddaddy of them all is Alice in Wonderland, which has been translated into 97 different languages. That's more than any other work of literature apart from the Quran or the Bible. So how does a nation of bankers and boozers, toffs and football hooligans come up with what is some of the most widely read and best-loved fantasy literature? What inspires our writers to create worlds of squirrels who wear Edwardian Sunday best, or scrupulously polite bears with wide circles of stuffed toy friends, or indeed wizards who have to go to school just like the rest of us? So I'm going to make it my business to talk to as many people as possible over the next few months, really just to find out what dominance in this field says about the British as a nation. Before starting the journey, I warmed up close to home at the River and Rowing Museum in Henley, about 10 minutes walk from my offices. The museum houses the Wind in the Willows exhibition, and as co-owner of 3 small children, it has saved my bacon on more than one rainy Sunday. Kenneth Grahame, who wrote Wind in the Willows in 1908, epitomises the gifted British amateur for me. Born in Edinburgh, but heavily influenced by childhood on the quintessentially English stretch of the Thames near Cookham in Berkshire, he was actually a banker by trade, secretary to the Bank of England no less. Grahame was part of a movement that shows how daily attitudes open the door to a new kind of fantasy. About the time of the Victorians, there was an explosion of fantasy writing of a kind where animals interact with humans less as potential food or foe. Wolves and witches, such as you find in the Brothers Grimm, receded from view and were replaced by animals who were fundamentally decent and they wore clean linen. It reflected a time when nature was becoming less of a threat, more of a friendly place to walk about in and have picnics. I went to meet the writer James Barclay. He's written 2 trilogies, Chronicles of the Raven and Legends of the Raven. His brand of fantasy is described as high, meaning it is set in its own world, like Lord of the Rings, that whilst it has to be entirely coherent, differs from low fantasy that is set in the real world, but with elements of magic, such as Harry Potter. James is also president of the British Fantasy Society. The very fact that there is such a thing I find slightly amazing, as if to elevate the genre to the ranks of the Royal College of Physicians or the British Academy. Afterwards, a friend lent me a boat to take on the river, weather permitting. Rivers do feature very highly as place or, for fantasy literature, don't they?
Yeah.
Why is that, do you think?
But there's a romance to boats and river travel, and again, that feeds into the whole sort of fantasy vibe too, and I think that's...
Yes, there is. And rivers flow, and I suppose that gives them a narrative.
Yes, really absolutely. They're never the same.
Yeah. You merely have to put 2 people
changing and
on
evolving,
a boat,
absolutely, yeah.
And there you almost have a journey. Sooner or later, their horses are going to give out, aren't they? They're going to have to get on the boat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, got to rest the horses.
So, what do you think it is about British fantasy writers that makes us so prolific in the genre?
I think it's down to the huge mix of cultures and mythologies that we've gathered together over the course of centuries. Celtic, Norse, German. I mean, whether by conquest or invasion, that doesn't really, it kind of almost doesn't matter.
But also we've sort of added something of ourselves to that. Although we've got lots of cultural identities, there does seem to be a type of British fantasy which is British, which is
Yeah.
different from anything else in the world. And you know, in your view, what is that? You know, what are the?
I think we've got these sort of romantic ideals of perfection and rurality, and if you go back to feudalism and to the sort of the medieval ideals and those sort of things. But I think at its heart, what we don't like is this idea of our rural idyls under threat, and that's a very British thing to protect this sort of purity, and that comes out in many fantasy books. But you add that to the mix of the laws and the myths that we've gathered from all over, particularly all over Europe, and you get this huge, rich mix of beauty and romance and malevolence and threat, and it's the perfect mix, the perfect recipe, if you like, for a fantasy writer to use. It's just this massive sort of bunch of tools that you can just gather just bits from. It's a huge. It's like just a great sort of smorgasbord of stuff you can bring in.
What about the sort of the quirkiness, though? What about the more playful elements?
Well, but I think all that does is add to the realism and the credibility of things, and things. You have to have stuff which isn't serious and desperately important and a hand on, sort of fist on the heart, so it's sort of incredible plot driving stuff. You need to have all these elements to make your piece of work complete. But I think in fantasy you can be more quirky and more interesting because you can draw on a much wider set of a much wider set of rules, because you're making your rules for your book.
Apart from crashing my friend's boat on the way back and all the grovelling I had to do, I think it went well. There was absolutely nothing half so much worth doing as simply messing about on boats, to paraphrase Ratty. And James gave me a lot of food for thought. There is certainly something in our turbulent past and our national geography that has produced a very particular set of national characteristics, a quirkiness and humour that lends itself to the genre. Initially, though, I wanted to look at where it all begins, that is to say, childhood.
Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand. For the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
Our imaginations and tastes are formed in childhood, and no one is more aware of this than Barry Cunningham, OBE. Barry cut his teeth at Penguin, working for the likes of Roald Dahl and Spike Milligan, before moving on to head up children's publishing at Bloomsbury. Whilst there, he was given a manuscript about a lonely boy with an incredible gift and an even more remarkable backstory. The book was by a first-time writer based in Edinburgh, a single mother, and had been turned down by everybody else. Joanne Rowling has observed that, if it wasn't for Barry Cunningham, Harry Potter might still be languishing in his cupboard under the stairs. Barry now heads his own children's imprint, Chicken House, in the town of Frome, just a stone's throw from Glastonbury. If there is anybody on the planet who understands what makes children tick when it comes to reading, it is Barry, and so it makes perfect sense to start here, when we first pick up a book of our own free will and lose ourselves in a private world that has nothing whatsoever to do with our parents, teachers, or siblings.
I knew nothing about publishing. And I thought, I finally got a job at Penguin, and I thought, I'm going to be an editor or something like that. I'm going to go out to lunch with famous people and I'm just going to give them a few words of advice. So I got there, and they gave me this effectively giant puffin costume to wear. And they said, your first job is to go out to schools dressed up as this giant book-eating monster and have fun. And I thought, well, this is not kind of what I thought it would all be. But again, it was about watching kids, because I don't know, Robin, if you've ever been a giant costume character, but actually it's really, really important experience, because you become this kind of anonymous friend of childhood. and you're big and you're friendly and you're nice, but they don't know who you are. So they hold your hand, or in my case, claw, and they tell you all their secrets. So I was a bit like an author. I was a secret friend of children really. And they told me what they liked. They told me what their best friend liked. They told me about their kind of hopes and dreams. And it was a really, really good introduction to why stories are important for kids, because they told me about the stories that matter. And it wasn't just, it just wasn't ordinary stories, because sometimes books are the only friends that children have, and they're their secret friends. They're the friends that they keep in their bedroom. They're the friends they have under the pillow. They're the friends when things get really tough at school that they read on their own on the bus. And they help them in really, really important ways, about what Roald Dahl used to call valour. Barry, I teach children valour. And they're teaching them stuff about facing up to difficulties and how you get by with the help of your friends, sometimes with your family, sometimes not, sometimes with adults, sometimes not with adults. So I kind of learned all that stuff when I was a giant costume character, really. He told me one day that he said, "Do you know about laughter, Barry?" It's my terrible impression of Roald Dahl. He said, "Do you know about laughter?" He said, in some ways, he said, somebody told me that laughter was delayed fear. And, that's really informed a lot of what I think about children's books. And if you think about the way that Roald Dahl and the other great children's writers use laughter and humour, it's one of the things that makes British books so distinctive and so powerful. Because if you're powerless, and often children are, and that's also why they associate with animals, because animals are often powerless and controlled by adults, and that you're moved around, you're said, here's your new daddy, here's your new school, we're going on holiday to somewhere you don't want to go to, you're going to leave all your friends behind. If you feel powerless, often the only weapon you have with dealing with that is humour. And if something bad is happening to you, somebody's being villainous to you, what's the one thing you've got? You can still laugh at them. You can still make fun of them. You can still make the horror of the situation dealable with if you say, "I'm not taking you seriously. You're a moron." And, it sounds like a simple lesson that children's books are funny, and children's fantasy, the best children's fantasy, uses humour in a creative and interesting way. But actually, I believe it's a deeply important reason why British fantasy is so successful.
So it's one thing to recognise the talent, and you talked about reading habits. It's quite another thing to not only sell a talent, but also, in a sense, go against what the current feeling is on reading habits. Is that something we're also particularly good at in Britain?
Yeah, I think you can make up all that kind of musical stuff about Britain and why we're good at recognising new things, and we're good at inversion. You could say that everything from the mystery plays to Monty Python is all about taking something and turning it on its head, making a joke out of something serious, because again, that's the way as a nation we deal with stuff. And we love dressing up, don't we? We love dressing in funny costumes and women's clothing. And inversion is from pantomime dames to, comics on television. We love that whole thing of taking something very sensible and making a joke out of it, but also making a serious point about how it's not really sensible, And I think it is a big heritage that we have, all those wonderful stories about, children and changelings and things left in the night and all that. And then we add this somewhat British sense of eccentric humour and inversion, and we come up with our ability to want to go to different worlds. Children are marvellously unconventional in the way that they'll follow stories, from giants to miniature people to horses that can fly. That they want to come into those worlds and live. But what you were saying was really interesting earlier. They want to live in those worlds with rules. So you have to have a firm framework of what is and what's not allowed. I used to work with a very famous Penguin author editor called Kay Webb, who was one of the earliest Puffin editors. And she said, you can get away with one big lie. You know, you'd be very small, very tall, go to the back of a wardrobe, you know, and go to a magic school. But after that, everything has got to be really, really organised because, you know, that's the way that children want to know. And she said something which I think is very important, and it's one of my great secrets of writing for children. She said, you've got to tell them what they're going to have for tea.
In the mid-90s, you were handed a book by an unknown author from Scotland, or who was writing in Edinburgh, and that obviously became the worldwide phenomenon, which is Harry Potter. Was there something of that legacy, the Roald Dahl legacy, or the legacy of humour in that struck a chord when, frankly, nobody else, I believe nobody else had picked her up?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those unbelievable things that you can't kind of almost imagine has happened. And in fact, Joe Rowling, years later, rang me up and said, I had a dream about you the other day. And I said, well, that's really nice. And he said, no. So I had a dream that you never took the book. And that, you know, it never happened. This whole thing never happened. And it is like one of her stories in a way, what did happen, because yeah, I got the first Harry Potter book, brown paper envelope, one night from an agent that I had a little bit to do with before. And he didn't tell me, agents never tell you, Robin, that 23 other publishers had turned this down. I noticed that the pages weren't exactly fresh, you know, obviously it had been read before. And I read it that night, and I had absolutely no hesitation for some of those reasons, really. I liked it because, do you know, I liked Hogwarts and I liked the owls and I liked all that, but I really liked the friendship. I liked the friendship between the characters that got them through it all. And I loved the way they used the humour. And, you know, if you laugh at danger, we often cry with happiness on the other way around, don't we? We often, when we're really happy about something, we cry. We're upset because we're so happy. And it's those kind of emotions that I thought, you know, would really, really affect children reading the book. But I'm an entrepreneurial publisher. I buy things. I'm a buyer, not a cooker, as we say in the business. So I buy stuff to sell to other people and help, and I'll edit it to make it sell better or to appeal better. But I don't. So the first time I read a book, I find it incredibly difficult to have a critical view because I just read it as a story, and at the end of it, I think, well, does that really work or not? But it's bizarre, isn't it, that you've got the biggest phenomenon in children's books, Harry Potter, coming from a single woman's imagination on a long train journey, and there was no marketing consultants, no focus groups, nothing like that. None of them come out of think tanks. They just come out of deep connection with writers with children's imagination. And that's what I think we should all be about. And that's why we're strong. And they're not really meant for adults. They're not meant to provide the level of uncertainty or the level of sexual complication. They're really about some very straightforward values, if you like, and if you had to pick one, it would be love and friendship, and the terrible fear of losing things, of losing someone that you love, losing an animal that you care about, that most awful thing in children's books, which is you lose a parent. They're about those kind of issues which are really important to children, and I don't believe they're quite the same issues.
The secret of Barry's success is in great part from being on the side of his readership, not the adults, and from recognising their need to escape. There's a knack for entrepreneurship at play, no doubt about it, an element of risk-taking that prompted him to pick up Harry Potter and not see a book that was simply too long and potentially complex. There is a desire to escape with children, forge ahead and create, which has perhaps never left some of us. Barry is so focused on what children hold dear, he inevitably has an inside track on an industry that can often lose its way chasing trends. When starting out as a children's writer, I constantly had drummed into me by the likes of people such as Barry how important it was to have a strong idea of place in my books. James also talked about how national geography and architectures has shaped our imaginations. Geography plays on the imagination, and writers are inspired by place almost as much as artists. Perhaps no place has more fitting claim to the title of First County of Fantastical Literature than Oxfordshire. To the west, Abingdon, the oldest settlement in Britain, and above the plain the Ridgeway, oldest road in Europe, trod by prehistoric man hunting the herds that followed the ice sheet that stopped here. The Thames, that springs from humble origins in the absolute heartlands of the home counties, linking hamlets with shire names like Cricklade, Filkin and Appleton. The river skirts beech woods where the light seems to come from quite another time, then broadens as it emerges at Port Meadow, where Lewis Carroll spun tales of Alice amongst an English jungle of dandelion and cowslip, under a buttered sun. And so to Oxford itself, home of Christchurch, Trinity, Balliol and Brasenose, tiny fiefdoms whose high walls and Castilian gates keep out the 21st century, screening the rest of us from hidden kingdoms, sanctuaries where writers such as Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Pullman conceived of some of the most enduring stories ever written in the English language. The next part of my quest was to seek out Diane Purkis, originally a child of the Commonwealth, having grown up in Sydney, Australia, now fellow and tutor at Keble College and author of numerous books on witches and fairies. Before I saw Diane, Lawrence Hughes of Footprints kindly offered to give me a tour of some literary sites in Oxford. So that's student accommodation, is it, over there?
Yes, indeed, yes, that's part of Merton College. In
Lucky
fact, that
sod.
building there, yes, that building there is where Tolkien had his rooms for many years, with a view overlooking the meadow there. This is the Alice shop. This is a rather nice little feature in Oxford. It's the actual shop itself was here in Alice's day, and she used to come and buy her sweets here.
Okay.
So it's a rather nice little old, genuine Victorian shop. It's absolutely full of everything you could possibly imagine to do with Alice in Wonderland. Well, this is the famous Eagle and Child, also known as the Bird and Baby in Oxford. That's its nickname in Oxford. This is where the Inklings met regularly for many years. The Inklings was a group of basically Oxford dons, professors and so on, featuring C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, also a writer called Charles Williams, who's a very interesting figure, and they used to meet here regularly once a week. And what they did, apart from drinking beer and singing songs in Anglo-Saxon, so I'm told, they would read extracts from their work in progress. So things like The Lord of the Rings and so on were actually first read out here in this pub.
What is it about Oxfordshire in general which attracts you as somebody who's very interested in folklore and fantasy?
Well, I think Oxford itself is so much the hometown of all fantasy lovers everywhere.
It is.
It belongs to everyone now who loves fantasy, because there
Yes.
isn't, I would argue, a single fantasy writer on earth that isn't aware that it exists. And I guess the only rival it's got is Prague, probably.
Yes.
But there's some sense in which this city is so rich in fantasy writers and in writers who are conscious of the landscape around them, from Lewis Carroll through J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, now Philip Pullman. I think we're looking at a world that is, as I described, a world that's where every corner and every door is imbued with meaning. And I think that's true of all of Oxfordshire, because let's not forget that Wind in the Willows and Alice in Wonderland are partly set in the Oxfordshire countryside.
Absolutely.
And set on the Thames side. It's crucial, I think, for Oxford's meaning, because Oxford and not Cambridge has this association. So it's not just the university and the colleges.
The Thames, you mean?
Yes, something about the Thames and the meaning of the fact that the river connects Oxfordshire with London, with another big world. And also that the river has a story, and carries with it a whole range of stories and associations that grant meaning to the landscape all around it. Then you've got the Ridgeway and the White Horse. So it's actually written on the land that there were these older fantasy stories of dragons and horse gods. And it's absolutely densely layered. So you can walk from Wayland Smithy up on the Ridgeway, which is one of my absolutely favourite places in Britain. It's a Neolithic barrow tomb.
And it's old.
It's incredibly old and utterly mysterious and strange. And you can walk from that down the hill to the White Horse, which is obviously recently maintained but also very ancient, into a lovely modern Georgian pub where they're serving traditional ale.
Yes.
And all those things are equally Englishness and equally imbued with the meaning that the past gave to them, that's still alive, that's still there, that's still available to the modern person. I think it is partly about the fact that to an outsider like myself who grew up somewhere else, one of the really astounding things about England is how very dark it is in winter and for how much of the 24-hour day it is dark, as opposed to summer where you have these glorious long light evenings. And that's something that most English people might associate maybe more with Scandinavia, but it's also very striking if you live here just how different the length of day in summer and winter really are. And so naturally, you've got a mythos that opposes light to darkness. We probably always did have a mythos, even in pre-Christian times, where you've got a literal dramatization often of a battle between that winter, cold, dark, infertile, deadly, and completely dead world versus the light, life, brightness, brilliance of a summer world.
The fact that Diane can be a respected academic on a subject like witchcraft shows how far we have come in taking fantasy out of the nursery and into the mainstream, and even highbrow. I was interested in meeting more people involved in today's fantasy industry. Writers can no longer write from ivory towers. Publishers and readers alike expect them to tweet, have Facebook pages, and even get out once in a while. And so I journeyed to the Magic Circle in London to rub shoulders with the great and the good of the British Fantasy Society. I'd always wanted to come here, but not owning a white rabbit or knowing any card tricks, its doors were sadly closed to untalented plebs like me. However, tonight is the occasion of the Gemmell Awards, and James got me a ticket. What I learned is how rich the subgenres of fantasy are. There is high fantasy, as we know, low fantasy, heroic fantasy, dark fantasy, comic fantasy, erotic fantasy, steampunk, magic realism, and all of this before we even get to science fiction and horror. My current favourite is Fantasy of Manners. It differs from traditional fantasy in that the foes are not magical beasts or armies of knights, but rather people in one's own social circle. Fantasy of Manners stories also share a kind of a tone, witty and wry. This tone is influenced by literary giants such as Jane Austen and Georgette Hare. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke seem to fit into this category with its Byronic heroes and Dickensian themes set to a backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. Bloomsbury was also so sure of its success that they printed 250,000 hardcover copies. The novel was well received by critics and reached number 3 in the New York Times bestseller list. It was longlisted for the 2004 Man Booker Prize and won the 2005 Hugo Award for Best Novel. British fantasy legend Neil Gaiman has described the book as unquestionably the finest English novel of the fantastic written in the last 70 years, and I agree. So where's it all leading? From King's Cross it's a short hop to East London to BritCon, where the great Joe Abercrombie held court to me about the future of the genre. If you haven't already heard of him, you will. Joe is the current big British name in a colossal genre. His first Lord trilogy has sold by the cartload, and his latest, Half a King, hit the Sunday Times bestseller list for fiction over the summer. Much of Joe's writing concerns conflict. In fact, a huge amount of fantasy literature from Beowulf onwards involves men with large axes and short fuses.
I caught up with Joe in his hotel room, which was fine apart from a misunderstanding with the maid service.
Oh. Yeah, maybe later on. Is that okay? Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Could clean the room now, I mean, I don't mind.
You'd have to get off the bed.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think she thought was going on?
I know.
There's a big reservoir, if you like, of people who are just now thinking, oh, this is maybe more interesting than I thought. Maybe I should try something else. You know, they've seen the TV, they've read all the George's books, and they're like, what's the next thing to try? And suddenly a lot of authors, I think, are benefiting a lot from that. So there's definitely a whole new, brave new world of readers who are being introduced to fantasy now. I hope.
Yes, and we hope also it doesn't disenfranchise the people who are into it now who might see it as a sort of a cachet.
Yeah, well, there's always going to be some hipster contrarianism, isn't there? About anything that is niche. There's always some people who would like to circle the wagons and, stay in the village, marry your sister, don't go out there in the mainstream where it's dangerous. But I think, there's nothing you can do. You can't stop people anyway from latching on at something and enjoying it. And to my mind, why would you ever want to? I mean, I think it feels like a real vindication that, something like Game of Thrones that I was a big fan of when it first appeared in book form is now, being so widely celebrated and enjoyed by so many people, and everyone's, seeing in it what I saw in it years ago. That feels really exciting to me.
Anyway, hanging out with your sister worked for the Lannisters.
It did. It worked superbly well for them. I think there's a degree to which as well, fantasy can be quite a powerful tool for investigating things that are real, because things that are perhaps a little too sore to pick at in the real world, when you use a kind of an allegorical approach, when you hold up the mirror, if you like, you can maybe investigate them a bit more freely within an invented place. Well, it's always possible to offend people, as I've discovered. My problem is not offending people. I seem to find it difficult to do that. I think it's important to offend people, though, up to a point.
One thing that comes out of your writing is humour. And humour's, I think, becoming much more apparent now. The fantasy's a lot less po-faced than it used to be. Black humour, in particular. Do you think that again is something? Do you think we might get a purely black humour, sort of Tarantino-esque?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been important to me, and it's always kind of something I felt was a bit missing in the fantasy that I read as a kid. I mean, Tolkien is clearly a magnificent and important writer in many ways, but he wasn't much of a humorist. And it wasn't what he was aiming for, particularly, to be fair.
There's very few gags, actually, in
Middle-earth. In Middle-earth. It's quite it's a serious place, and I think the fantasy that came after, in imitating that style with a lot less subtlety, maybe became a bit ponderous, a bit pompous at times. And on the other side, you had kind of out-and-out satire, that succeeded by properly taking the piss out of the pomposity of fantasy, if you like. And I was always looking for something that was between the two, that had the feeling that Tarantino you talked about, definitely, but, someone like Mike Leigh or Alan Ayckbourn, those kind of playwrights and writers who, see the ridiculousness of real life and the humour in quite horrible circumstances sometimes. And so that was very much the feeling that I've always been after, to try and, make people laugh, make people cry, get the full range of emotional reaction. I think the way you paint a vivid character, if you can, as well, is a lot of that is through humour. It's the sense of humour, the individual way a character has of expressing themselves, the wit. I think that can endear you to some quite unpleasant characters who otherwise would be pretty much unbearable.
And also then it means as the author, you're not damning any of your creations. You don't have that kind of, well, they are just completely and utterly bad. They're bad, but they're also quite funny. So there's a redeeming feature there.
Yeah, and I think we're not that interested, not as interested as we were in kind of unexamined evil. It doesn't convince in the way that it used to, perhaps. We love a good villain, always. They're some of the most...
Can I come in? Oh, sorry, I'm coming back.
Yeah, the idea of the kind
She keeps missing her cue.
Yes, any minute now. We're almost ready for you. The idea of the kind of the utterly evil villain that maybe doesn't inspire us in the way it used to. We want to understand the motivations of someone. We want them to be a believable character.
And to understand is almost to forgive.
Well, it's certainly to have an insight,
War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend.
It's not really a coincidence that fantasy and empire seem to peak as part of a cycle. War was something else we showed a talent for and exported across the globe before we became gentler and took out our aggression on fictitious enemies in print instead of in other nations of the world. Much of fantasy writing deals with conflict, something else the British seem to have a talent for. During its history, British forces or forces with a British mandate have invaded, had some control over, or fought conflicts in 171 of the world's 193 countries. That's 9 out of 10 of all countries. Food for thought. There's simply too much blood and mayhem in the genre to pass it off as regrettable necessity. Purely in the spirit of research, of course, I decided to see what the attraction was for myself. Initially I went to a couple of reenaction places to ask them about getting into a fight with someone. After telling me about insurances and risk assessments, it just didn't seem that much fun anymore. So I went online. It's amazing what you can get for a few £100. Courtesy of a French wife, we spend a good deal of our time in the Pyrenees in the south of France, home to Grail legend, Cathal myth, tales of Roland and Charlemagne, and the perfect backdrop for a fight. A friend of mine, Nick, was once in a Welsh Conan-type film in the 1970s, and he agreed to help me work through some issues.
It was a time of great evil, an age of heroes, when the forces of darkness seemed overwhelming. Were it not for one man, in cheap armor he got off eBay.
I'm in York this weekend, which was founded by the Romans in AD 70 and became the city of pillaging choice for the Vikings 800 years later. I'm at the FantasyCon 2014, which is the British Fantasy Society's annual convention. One of the authors I'm due to see today is Joanne Harris. Joanne has written over 14 novels, the most successful of which to date is Chocolat, which was made into an Oscar-nominated film. Joanne started her Rune series in 2007, and her type of writing is very different from the grittier, oft-times more violent writing of, say, Joe Abercrombie. She deals with the essential, the magic and the mystery of everyday objects, of motherhood, and the sensuality of the simple pleasures.
I think even now there's a general reluctance to accept that you like fantasy and sci-fi outside of certain circles, and certainly in the mainstream of literature. You've got writers like Margaret Atwood, for instance, who's clearly writing sci-fi, but who doesn't acknowledge that it's sci-fi. I think we've got more strong female characters. We have more active female characters rather than women being introduced because they're a love interest or because they are the reward for the hero at the end of his quest. And this is all to the good. But I think that this is a shift from the kind of old-fashioned folklore and fairy tale inspired story, which is very, very masculine in many ways, that the hero is nearly always, that the active hero is usually a man. The heroine is generally quite passive, is awaiting her prince. Her reward is love and marriage.
So what makes us unique?
We're a small island with big ideas. Big ideas make for big stories, and we are still dreaming all of the time, and that's why.
Why are we dreaming though? What makes us such dreamers?
Because as such a small country, having achieved so much and gone so many places, I think we have an inherent romanticism in our makeup. And we are constantly wanting to push boundaries. We've pushed the boundaries of empire. We've had a rich, varied history. Now we're looking at the boundaries of what can be done in fiction. And of course, dreaming has no boundaries, and so, you know, we're continuing to push them.
That swashbuckling spirit then, is that entrepreneurial as well?
We are pirates. We're quite civilized pirates, but we're pirates.
We're diffident pirates, self-effacing pirates maybe.
Yes, pirates with a sense of humour and reasonably good manners.
That's what we want, fantastic.
I also managed to catch up with Gillian Redfern, publishing director at Gollancz, which is owned by Hachette, and Joe Fletcher, founder of Joe Fletcher Books. They both gave me an insight into how top authors are discovered, and more importantly, how they are nurtured.
I think we're reasonably stubborn and we're quite persistent. So if we believe in a book, then we continue to work with the author and we continue to promote them. We invest in their careers. Mm-hmm. And just because something didn't catch fire within 10 minutes of hitting the bookshop doesn't mean that it won't. Doesn't mean that you might not become an overnight success having been in the industry for 6 years or with your 9th novel. Yeah. It's always possible that that's going to be the one which changes the publishing landscape.
90% of the books are subsidised by the 10% that sell. That's what publishing is. You know, we get asked all the time, and sadly by people within the publishing company, why don't you just publish the bestsellers? Well, how do I know what a bestseller is? I always describe it as a good fantasy novel is like Ginger Rogers. We have to do everything Fred Astaire does, but on high heels and backwards.
Right.
And so we have to have, if you think about it, we have to have characters that you can empathise with, that you want to know what happens.
Yes.
We've got to have a plot that is riveting enough to make you want to turn the page.
Yes.
Theoretically, and I was trying to get writing that rings off the page.
And for some reason you've just not hit the perfect description for it for 3 years, and out of the blue someone will say something in a blog piece which will nail it, and that's all that you needed. It's sort of the word of mouth starts and away it goes.
Yes.
There's a kind of magic to it sometimes that's that requires time and requires patience and requires persistence. People have said, well, you have to write 1 million words to become a writer, or you have to bin your first 3 novels, or whatever it is. But the process of doing that much writing hones the craft. And the thing that the really extraordinary writers have done is work that potential. And they've often done it by themselves over 10 or 15 or 20 years to get everything in place in one manuscript at the same time.
Is that 10,000 hours as well? You
Yes,
can be good at
10,000
anything
hours.
After 10,000 hours. Or,
Yeah.
I rather suspect I would never be good at football. 10,000 hours.
It has been my firm belief that sooner or later, if you are good enough, you will find someone who is willing to pay their good cash money to get you to an audience. I think that I think there will be self-published authors who are wonderful come out of it. I'm quite sure of it, and I look forward to that. And they may decide that they don't need to take a traditional publishing path, and if that's the case, good luck to them. I hope there won't be too many, because I like what I do, but I'm quite sure there will be some.
So it's an enormous process, really.
Oh, it is. It's writing a novel is an extraordinarily long process, and writers are quite extraordinary people who've chosen to engage with that world for hours and hours and hours a week, for years sometimes, rather than be out in the pub with their friends, or be with their families, or watch TV, or sleep in some cases.
Yes.
And then once they've crafted their magnum opus and edited it themselves, then an editor sometimes an agent will come along and read and request structural changes, and then an editor will come along and request further changes, and so they'll take that away and rework their novel. And then when they bring it back, a lot of editors will then do a line edit. So they'll say, well, this is structurally, it all now works, the characters make sense, the storyline is all functioning and marvellous, but there are some rough edges. And we'll go in and say, well, this word isn't working in this sentence, this paragraph isn't quite conveying the image as clearly as it might. This doesn't make sense. Looking at this again, do we need this section, which is beautiful and descriptive and lyrical, but it's also quite slow and it's a large book, so can we take it out? All of that sort of thing goes into the next pass. So the poor author works on it again to sort of hone it and bring it into the shape, or the best version of the shape it can be.
These days, what have you got at your disposal? What have we got at, you know?
Well, I suppose the interweb is the
Indeed,
biggest tool that any publisher has.
Yeah.
We used to have, when I worked at Glance,
Yes.
we had the pink ticket rule, which was that each of us was allowed one author who might not sell but was too important to the list not to keep supporting. Writers writing in English are still seen as proper writers in a lot of countries. If you look at their lists, a lot of their lists are translated fiction rather than homegrown. I'm not saying it's right, but it is a fact that it is only in recent years that Germany, France have been publishing their own writers writing fantasy.
Why are the British so wrapped up in fantasy when we're not really perceived as people who are sort of, we're not fantastical people? the rest of the world sees as rather sometimes cold and a bit aloof. Why is it, do you think, that we are so good and so wrapped up in fantasy?
I think the British are quite repressed and quite quiet, and as a result we have a vibrant inner life. We're imaginative, we're engaged with our surroundings, and it makes us a little bit more open to some fantastical elements which are slightly greater than the world around us and slightly more expressive than we generally allow ourselves to be.
As Gillian and Jo seem to suggest, good editing is at the heart of it, and from personal experience I agree. Without it, you might have untapped talent, brilliant but rudderless. They're the bridge between the reader and the author. Knowing what works in the market and getting the best out of your author are key.
Here are the stiffening hills. Here the rich cargo congealed in the dark arteries, old veins that hold Glamorgan's blood. The midnight miner in the secret seams, limb, life, and bread.
There may very well be something of the commercial instinct in the way we have borrowed, shaped editorially, and then marketed, popularised and presented these other worlds, these tales of magic and mayhem. But the upside to popularism is, well, popularity. And excellent editors like Gillian, nimble, smaller publishers like Jo, and entrepreneurs like Barry are what has ensured that they have found fertile and engaged readerships, young and old, in virtually every nation. Countless readers who have lost themselves for a time in these stories, escaping to worlds like ours, but not quite. Just as we developed the cotton trade from India, opium from China, and oil from the Middle East, so we plundered myth and saga for our own ends. Tolkien from Norse mythology, ditto whoever actually wrote Beowulf, Shakespeare Italy, Shelley from Central Europe, Lewis the Bible, albeit allegorically, and Rowling from practically everywhere. In fact, very little myth is our own, but we've long shown a talent for taking the best bits and making something universally tantalising. Having been to York and met the writers and readers alike, I don't think anyone would be offended if I remarked that many were somewhat eccentric, in a good way of course. Eccentricity seems to be a national badge of honour, and so much of what we write, from the gentle eccentricity of Paddington Bear to the madcap world of Alice, reflects this. Stories of British eccentrics abound. In fact, we seem to specialise in literary Fruit Loops, like Byron, who kept his own bear at Cambridge, having been told that dogs were not allowed. Oscar Wilde went one better and walked a lobster about a leash in Oxford. I felt like catching up with an old school friend, the Honourable James Hope, and somebody who comes from a long line of eccentrics himself. After supper we had a chat about eccentricity in the British.
But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. Well, you must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Have I gone mad? I'm afraid so. But let me tell you something. The best people usually are.
So, what is it? I mean, are we all mad?
No, we're British. The rest of the world's mad. That's how we look at it, and that's how we've survived, isn't it? That's what's protected us. Everybody else is wrong and mad, and doesn't even speak the right language, and we're fine. We're fine. We don't understand why everyone doesn't live that way.
So the French lock their mad people up. The Germans vote for them, and the British like them to be a sort of a spokesperson.
Yes. Now you've had it, you see.
Yes.
A few weeks later I met up with James at Southwold Pier, home to the usual crop of sausage roll connoisseurs, anglers, and the type of British people who enjoy nothing better than a short walk that goes nowhere. It also houses the slightly bonkers world of Tim Hunkin's Machines, an amusement arcade that's probably unlike any other on the planet. It showcases Heath Robinson devices, alternate reality arcade games such as Walk the Dog, My Nuke, and Frisk the Mother-in-Law.
Yes, yes. I don't know about the selfie. I invented the selfie, do you know that? Yes. Piers are a bit pointless, aren't they?
Very. They go nowhere.
No.
They actually do very little.
It is just a very short bridge to nowhere.
Except for the one that was very long in Southend, I think, which is a long way going nowhere.
Just going back to the conversation we had earlier when you mentioned liberalism, and it was something that I hadn't really sort of thought about before, but it's true that we do allow our eccentrics to be, don't we, much more than other countries who maybe sort of put the lid on them.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's our own diffidence that's allowed it or whether we just are a little bit happier with lots of people being very different in amongst us, and we are not going to be very hard on them. In fact, we welcome them. And
sort of, though. I mean, there's that thing, you know, we're quite happy to have eccentrics as long as they don't live next door.
Yes, but we do want them on our television sets, and we do want them in our books and in our entertainment, to the extent that they are a massive creative force for us in a way I don't see elsewhere. I'd say that they are probably one of the big factors in some of the probably the global exports now that we have in the entertainment world, simply because they are different, and we allow them to be different in this country in a way that is enriched us a lot.
And it is strange. We are allowed to be different. We're not allowed to do lots of things in this country. We're not allowed to use the wrong fork. We're not allowed a cue barge.
Yeah, that's etiquette, though.
Indeed, but it is etiquette. But we are allowed to, you know, call yourself Mandy and walk down the street if you're a 6 foot, you know, 4 hod carrier. I tell you what, though, talking about humour, it's hysterical. I pulled off the internet last night this American guy explaining British humour that he'd heard at the Edinburgh Festival.
Oh, okay.
And he starts off as Jack Whitehall. I bought one of those anti-bullying wristbands when they first came out. I say bought, I actually stole it off a short, fat ginger kid. And the explanation was, in Britain they sell bracelets to prevent bullying or something. I think that's the whole joke. and then he kind of goes on, he goes, Gareth Richards, wooden spoons are great. You can either use them to prepare food, or, if you can't be bothered with that, just write a number on one and walk into the pub. And the explanation is hysterical. It goes, explanation, I'm stumped. Is this about spanking or something? British people are so weird.
They do love the idea that we do spanking.
They do. But it's almost as varied as fantasy British humour. I mean, you've got the Beano, which is basically laughing at bullying. You've got the humour of names. I mean, that could never exist in France. I mean, the French, you know, would never put up with having to live in a village in Yorkshire called West Wang, or Wet Wang, actually, I think.
Or one near here, 6 Mile Bottom.
Yeah, you know. There you go. They would have changed the name by now.
Yes, just slightly probably. So. You know.
Well, there is a condom, isn't there, in France?
Is there? It probably doesn't mean the same thing there.
No, it's a rubbery press.
It's a rubber factory.
Yes. So understatement is at the heart of it, and a sort of liberalism. This love of other worlds, bankers writing about wise badgers and irresponsible toads, is a sort of flip side to our habitual restraint of not quite saying what we really mean, that the rest of the world views as aloofness, added to a propensity to say sorry rather a lot. In our literature, we allow ourselves a freedom we'd otherwise not show others. As James was saying, we revere and we don't revile our eccentrics. We allow them to speak for us, to say the things we wouldn't normally say. It also seems that this tremendous body of work came about as an escapism from the humdrum, or worse, from the horrors of war. And perhaps not to escape, but to reflect what is deep within us as a nation. Thus, it could be a reflection of this, the British psyche, a literary eccentricity that makes perts of us all, but not a song of peace, but one of conflict, beauty and imagination whose driving force is bloodletting and conquest, going back to our beginnings as a nation.
I was coming to the end of my quest.
I didn't just drive to Norfolk, I spooled down the years back in time to an indistinct age caught halfway between verifiable history and legend, to the Dark Ages, and to one man in particular who may never even have existed, to Arthur. I went to see one of the elder statesmen of the genre, the writer and poet Kevin Crossley Holland, whose own Arthurian trilogy has been translated into over 25 languages and it tells the story of Arthur through the eyes of a boy of the same name, living hundreds of years later in medieval Britain. There is something of the Magus about Kevin to my mind, and it's no accident that he recently played the part of Merlin in the Story Museum in Oxford. It's a fitting place being here. These flat shores seem ideal even now to run a longboat up and forge inland to raid and to settle. But the Saxon raiders sweeping across from this eastern coast were checked by Arthur, apparently, at the Battle of Mount Badon, that a slim majority have down as Salisbury Hill in Bath. Throughout the making of this programme, Arthur's name kept cropping up. At times he seems everywhere, his story rooted in this land from Carlisle to Cornwall, Cardigan to Colchester. And it's not just that stories of his battles seem to cover the country. Arthur the man seems to speak more to the imagination than anyone I can think of in what is an extraordinary host of forceful characters. He seems to have all the best themes: the fight against good and evil, honour, courage, mystical religion and magic. And with the best sidekick in literary history, Merlin, and the best accessories, Excalibur and the Grail, amongst others.
There was a man who fought 12 great battles, well reported, before very long, against the Saxons, the great enemies of the Celts. And they were fought, culminating in a battle at somewhere called Mons Badonicus, which could be Baden Castle in Dorset. Wherever and whatever the truth of all that, these battles held up the Saxons, perhaps for a generation. My sense is that with the great historical figures, they become like magnets, and all kinds of bits and pieces gravitate to them, and that there was a leader, a Celtic leader, perhaps with Welsh, perhaps with Strathclyde connections, who did stop the Saxons. And there are tiny little chips of information, little hints. In the same way, the birth records of North Wales for the 6th, 7th, 8th century show that quite suddenly the name Arthur was being very, very much more widely used. Why? It's that kind of little hint that suggests that there was indeed a historical figure. But you couldn't possibly call him a king, of course not. You'd call him, I suppose, an Iron Age warlord. He probably had arthritis. He probably lived on the top of somewhere like Maiden Castle in Dorset or Cadbury Castle in Somerset. He had a group of fanatically loyal followers, and he was committed to driving back the Saxons from, well, we call them Saxons, but actually they were Angles and Saxons and Frisians and Jutes, all coming in different groups into Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent, Hampshire, and then moving inland up the river systems. But he has nothing whatsoever to do with the Romance figure of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, who is the Arthur who's familiar to most of us. Different authors took the stories of Arthur for their own reasons. But if you start looking at Arthur through the centuries, because he has this extraordinary gift of changing and representing himself, you see him as tetchy, you see him as old, you see him as young, you see him as rather weak, you see him as thrusting. And of course, by the time you get to Tennyson and Ideals of the King, he is the sort of embodiment of family values, a good Victorian figure. And in the 20th century, probably more than any previous century, he's presented in all kinds of guises.
Does Arthur then represent an idealised version of how the British see themselves?
I think Arthur represents a dream. If you're asking what is the role of Arthur in relation to the British, again, it's a changing one in most respects, except that he is the dream, he is the embodiment, he's the hub of a better time an ideal time, a golden age. It's what we can aspire to in our own lives. There are actually, couple of hundred places associated with Arthur in Great Britain, all over the shop, and very well summarised in a book by Derek Brewer called Arthur's Britain, I think it was. But David Jones's lines are the ones that stick in my mind. They're not quite well enough for me to memorise them, but nevertheless, I'm just going to read you a very few. Yet he sleeps on. Very deep is his slumber. How long has he been the sleeping lord? Are the clammy ferns his rustling valance? Does the buried rowan ward him from evil, or does he ward the tanglewood? And the denizens of the wood, are the stunted oaks his gnarled guard, or are the gnarled limbs strong with his sap? And then crucially, are the slumbering valleys, think of the valleys of Wales, for instance, rising and falling, are the slumbering valleys him in slumber? Are the still undulations the still limbs of him sleeping? Does the land wait the sleeping lord, or is the wasted land that very lord who sleeps?
Stuck on the M11 driving back from Norfolk, it dawned on me that I really didn't care whether Arthur existed or not as a man. The fact is, I think he's best curated by the storytellers. As Kevin was saying, Arthur is better as an idea, a blueprint for Britishness, ruthless when called upon, but a unifier of a nation, a forger of law and honour in this melting pot of a country that we love.
My journey was now at an end. I hadn't been attacked by orcs or fallen down any rabbit holes, and the only harm I came to was a broken finger, giving Nick a good vanquishing. However, I had some answers, so it felt worthwhile.
Through this process, I've come to the conclusion that the three images at the start of the programme, the banker, the hooligan, and the eccentric English gentleman, are therefore not in the least at odds with our propensity for the fantastic. Actually, these national attributes are very much the basis for the writers who sit down at their desk and conceive highly imaginative books of escapism, commercially viable stories that pull together a potent and enchanting cocktail of violence, humour, honour and eccentricity. We do have a unique gift for the sublime and the ridiculous, and the ability to be able to sell this to the rest of the world. Going a bit deeper, I've also realised that the roots of these national characteristics come from two ideas that seem to be deeply unfashionable these days: cohesiveness as a nation and immigration. As Britain, we have the inventiveness of the Scots with the likes of George MacDonald, seen by many as the father of modern fantasy, the rich imagination of Irish folklore, Welsh legend such as Arthur, where much of it starts, and the freewheeling, entrepreneuring instincts of the English. And on the thorny issue of immigration, we have our history of assimilating nations that have come to our shores as friend or fearsome enemy, from the Romans, the Saxons and the Vikings, to the present day soft invasions, and seeing it as an opportunity to enrich, not shun. When Britain seems to be breaking up politically and economically, what will remain culturally or otherwise? And will it be able to keep the edge? Indeed, what else makes us stand out, punch above our weight? What else are we quietly good at? But with this literary legacy, the main thing though is that we all love it, or at the very least we should be proud of it as a nation. Fantastic Britain.
This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea,